All right. So we are continuing our exploration, obviously, of First John, and today we got to a place where it's probably if there's a most famous verse in First John, and the thing that we probably know the most, it's that line, "Perfect love casts out all fear." Right? I mean, if you want like something that is just made for a cat poster, right? Or one of those like inspirational like sayings, right? I mean, there's ever like designed to be on a greeting card, right? It is that phrase. Perfect love casts out all fear. And in my mind, like the cat would have to be like on gripping onto something high or something like that, right? You can picture it, you can. So John is going this conversation, and he's been having this conversation the whole time about love and what does it mean, and all of that. And here we get this important relationship that he starts to build between this idea of love and this idea of fear. Now, I think sometimes we might misunderstand what he means here. When he says don't be afraid, it's not because he thinks everything's always going to work out all the time. Right? And he's in a community where things are not working out all the time. He doesn't think that things are just going to be easy all the time either, or that, that magically all of the problems are going to disappear. Right? It's a community that's been in conflict. It's a community that continues to have some conflict. They're not sure about what's going on. They're not sure about what their future is. They're concerned because at this point, as we talked about last week, John is getting up there in years, and he's probably not going to be with them much longer. And oh my gosh, what are we going to do once he's gone? And how are we going to keep being the church? And how are we going to keep following Jesus if he's not here? So you can see why, it's interesting that John speaking into this place with all of this anxiety, and he's telling them this really kind of crazy idea that at the time must have sounded a bit nuts, because he's saying, do not be afraid. Do not have fear. And they have to be thinking to themselves, is he serious? There's a lot to be worried about. Now, the opposite of fear isn't actually, when he says don't have fear, he doesn't mean be reckless, right? He's not telling them to necessarily go and do silly things. He's not telling them to be reckless necessarily. But when he says the opposite, he says have fear, do not have fear. The opposite of fear is not recklessness. The opposite of fear, as John understands it here, is faith. What he is saying is, yes, I know that you can't see the future and neither can I. Yes, I know that we don't know how all this is going to work out. Yes, I know there are problems that we need to work on that need to be overcome. Yes, it is uncertain exactly where all this is going to go and what it's all going to be. But he says, don't dwell in fear about that. With the other side being, have faith. Not living in fear is about having faith. And one of the things that we like to talk about in this church a lot, and if you're one of the people who's been around here for a while, you may even have the blue wristband that has it on it. That's the OG one. You know you've been around and you're legit if you've got the blue wristband. I don't know. We don't have any more of those. Those are all gone. We're going to have to buy some more, I guess. But it says very quite clearly, it says, love God, love neighbor, and love yourself. John is sort of going along those lines and saying, the other part of loving somebody, the other part of loving something, is having faith in them. So in a way, John is saying in this moment, yes, love God, love neighbor, love yourself. Have faith in God. Have faith in your neighbor. And have faith in yourself. Unfortunately, we live in a world today where there are organizations, where there are institutions whose whole job it is, who see it as their job, to make sure that they can tell us all the reasons why we should not have faith in our neighbors or faith in ourselves. It's really easy to sell a lot of newspapers to get people to tune in, to your TV station, or get you to click on their article on Facebook, if the headline is something about how terrible other people are. As people of faith, we have a different message. And again, it's not a message of recklessness. It's not a message of naively accepting everything that people tell us by any means. But what John wants us to know is what God wants us to know, is that we are called to have faith. We are called to have faith in God. And John is reminding the people in that community that part of what they are called to do, if they are going to love God, is they need to love neighbor. And if they're going to trust God, they need to trust their neighbors around them as well. And that is how we get to be God's children. Now, that's hard to live out, and I recognize that. It is a lot easier to be afraid. And it's also easy to say, of course I trust my neighbor, or of course I trust God, or of course I have faith in these things. It's a lot harder when we are called to put that faith into action, or called to take a risk that requires us to have that faith in God, faith in neighbor, and faith in ourselves. One of the first times I ever visited Denver was actually about 10 years ago. I was here as part of a young clergy thing, and they basically were bringing people, representatives of all the young clergy together from different parts of the western United States, and we were coming to this conference that was here or down in Denver. At the time, they're like, well, you can have, there's two of us, basically two from every state, so two clergy under 35 from each state. Problem was, I was the only clergy under 35 in the state of Montana. So I got to go. It was great. There wasn't a lot of debate about that one. And actually people would say, people from other places would say, you could have brought two. And I'm like, well, no. There's only one of us. And it's me. So I got to come, and they brought us together to talk about church and talk about things and to support each other and do all that stuff. And one of the things they did is we went around and visited various places. And there was a place that we visited down in Denver that's still there called the Same Cafe, S-A-M-E, the Same Cafe. And it had been come into existence in 2006 by a couple, Brad and Libby Berkey. What's a good last name? And we got to meet them and talk to them about what they were doing there. And you go in there, and it comes across, you look at it as like a restaurant, like any other kind of restaurant. It's a little cafe. They have a fairly limited menu, but they make everything from scratch in-house. And the food was actually rather good. But it's kind of a nice little, kind of what you would expect in a nice little local cafe. And when you first walk in, you may not notice anything in particular until you go and order. And then you go and you look at the menu, and it's a chalkboard menu because it changes by day depending on what they have. And so you go and you order, and then something really interesting happens. Nobody asks you for any money at the Same Cafe. Instead, at the time, this was like 2010, at the time there was a box at the end of the counter, and you could put money in the box, however much or however little you wanted to. So if you could come in, and if you only had $2 to spend on lunch, you could get lunch and you could give them $2. If you could afford more, you could pay more. If you could afford less, you'd pay less. And they talked about, Brad and his wife talked about how they came up with this idea really on the back of a napkin on an airplane flight from Austin to Denver. And they discovered there was one other cafe in the United States that they could find that operated like this, and it was in Salt Lake City. So they called those folks and got some advice from them. Says, how does this work? How do you make this work? What do you do? What kind of organization do you need? What kind of structure is it? And their passion for this had come out of the fact that they had full-time jobs, regular jobs. He was in computers, she was doing something else. But they liked to volunteer in food pantries, and they volunteered in soup kitchens, and they volunteered in those places because they had a passion for making sure that hungry people got to eat. I know, it's crazy idea. And they decided, well, wouldn't it be neat if we could have a place where basically everybody could come, and if you could afford it, great, and if you can't, then it's fine. And of course, they have to have fundraisers, and they do those sorts of things. And they started to explain this to some of their friends and families, and some of them got on board, and some of them really thought they were crazy, right? Right? You're nodding. You're like, this sounds nuts. And what sounds nuts about it is not that it sounds like it's a bad idea, right? That, it's not a bad idea. As people of faith, as followers of Jesus, we're kind of on the, let's try to feed the hungry people train, right? That Jesus had some very direct words about that. We don't get to not care about that as followers of Christ, which is, again, why we do things around here like support the food pantry and Corps and all those stuff that we do, because it's part of who we are. So they just kind of wanted to take that into the next level. What they found out, what everyone assumed, is that nobody would pay, right? That was the assumption, was that nobody would actually give them any money. That if you could get a free meal, well, of course you were going to do that. And they really decided their whole model for this, what they wanted to do for their nonprofit, was based on this fundamental assumption that people actually at their core weren't like that. That if they give people the opportunity, those who can to give, that those who can pay will. And you know what? They started in 2006. It's 2021, and they're still there. And and of course, they do what other nonprofits do. They do fundraising and all that sort of stuff. But they also will tell you that what they receive in donations on the average is more than what the food costs to make. And when they have to do fundraising, they're doing fundraising for things like rent and things like that. But on the most part, even during 2008, even during the financial crisis, yes, the amount of the average donation went down, but they still, people still, on the whole, gave. And he said it was not uncommon at the day, and back, especially in the days when they were basically only taking kind of cash and check. I think they have a station you can swipe your credit card now, which is good, because even back in 2010, I didn't carry cash, so I had a free lunch there because I didn't have anything to give them. I mailed them a check later. It's fine. Actually, my wife mailed them a check later because I don't know how those things work. I haven't written a check in years. I think they have a credit card station now, but even at that, they would say it was on the weekly. They would open up the box and find a $100 bill, or open up the box and maybe a $50 bill. And the thing I love about their story, and you will actually find more of these. You will find this model of pay what you will or pay what you can, has actually spread, and you will find more of these kind of places, especially in bigger cities, really around the U.S. now, and it's spread to other things as well. But I love this story. I love the idea of going out and building what is essentially a business. It's a nonprofit, obviously, but it's building a business based on the idea, on the assumption that neighbors really do want to love their neighbors, and when given the chance, people will show their love to other people, even up to and including how much they're willing to take out of their wallet. We are called to love God, love our neighbor, and love ourselves. We are called to have faith in God. Faith in neighbor and faith in ourselves. The challenging part is, at the end of the day, for most of us, may not even be the faith in neighbor piece, though. I think sometimes the biggest challenge, I know this is the biggest challenge for me, is actually the having faith in myself part. Especially when I'm asked to do something that I've never done before, don't feel I have any experience in, and generally looks like it could go horribly and terribly wrong. And so when I think about those times that I've been asked to do something that I don't feel prepared for, and where it has the potential to go horribly and terribly wrong, obviously the first thing that ever comes to my mind is when my eldest child was born. That could have gone awfully and terribly wrong. There's Gavin. Believe it or not, Gavin did not have hair for pretty much the first 2 years he was alive, and I think he's making up for it now. Obviously. So I love you, son. But it's also Mother's Day, so we got to tell this story. Apologies. But not really. All right. So this is literally the day that Gavin was born, and obviously I was there. I was obviously not the person doing the principal amount of work the day Gavin was born, but I was there. I did my part. I held the hand well. I think she's nodding. I think. Okay, good. All right. Now so you go to the hospital, and for those of you who've had this experience, you go to the hospital. You go to the hospital without a baby. Really, and then you leave the hospital with the baby. That's weird. And actually, the thing that I remember the most I remember most the day that Gavin was born, but I also remember the next day when we left, right? Because they make sure, it's the 21st century, right? So they make sure that you actually have a car seat to put him in. You can't just put him in a cardboard box and throw him in the back seat of the car. Apparently, you all used to do that. You're not allowed to do that anymore, and they will make sure you don't. FYI. So your grandkids are not coming home in cardboard boxes. So there you go. I forgot to say, this title of this picture is Babies Come with Hats. And why that's funny is because we didn't know that, right? And so we get Gavin, we're leaving the hospital, we put Gavin, we latch him into the back of the car, that one thing we practiced, and we're making the 1.5 mile drive back home, and I don't know if it's just because we were exhausted or tired or what, but Dane and I, my wife and I, both just start kind of giggling, and the giggling kind of turns into laughter, and I look at her, and I'm like, they let us leave with this child. Why on earth did they let us leave with this child? How are we qualified? I think before Gavin was born, my wife and I combined had been responsible for the care of an infant for a combined total of 0 minutes, right? No one had ever trusted us with an infant before. No one had ever come up with a small child and go, I'm going to leave it with those two because I think they look well prepared for that. No one did that. For a good reason. My wife, I'm a middle child. I did my best to ignore my younger brother. I didn't really do much with him. Dane was an only child, never really babysat growing up. We knew nothing. And I actually remember sitting with Gavin, actually, before we left the hospital. Dane was sleeping, and I was holding him, and I looked down, and I'm like, kid, I will do my best, but I know nothing. I don't know what you need, but we will figure it out. And he's still here. Just like the same cafe and just about as old, right? Big surprise to me. The other thing that surprised me when we brought Gavin home was that people started to show up. Actually, when we were in the hospital, I had just gone back to, I'd gone back to church a few years before. I had been volunteering a little bit at the church. We were at the hospital. Our pastor showed up at the hospital to say a prayer for us and our child, and it freaked us out. Because we're like, why are you here, right? Apparently, I learned at that moment, that's something that they do, if you don't know. And then other friends started to call us on the phone and said, hey, you need anything? And we're like, no, we don't need anything. We're okay. We're guys left. And then they would pause and they would giggle, especially our friends who already had kids. And they would giggle and they're like, no, really? Have you eaten? Well, it's been a while. I will bring you some food. And they did, right? And this became the thing, and it became that thing for the next couple of weeks. And they kept, people kept coming, and they kept checking in on us, and people would call us, and people would just kind of stop by with random things. Those neighbors that we had chosen to love, neighbors that were related to us, some of those who weren't, some of them literally, our neighbors who literally lived next door, who we'd met 3 times, came by with a little stuffed animal and to make sure we were okay. We were pretty certain they were coming by to yell at us because Gavin also screamed a lot. You were not a good sleeper, son. Not like you are now. Anyway. And of course, by the time we got to Vivian, we're like, when can we get out of the hospital? We're all experts at this now. Let's go, right? When I meet parents now, and what I'm blessed to get to be around parents now, and especially parents who are expecting their first child now, and they come to me, or we're talking, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's this, and I'm sure it's going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay." And I'm like, "Yes, it is. It's not going to be what you expect, right? It's not." And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, it's not that what you're about to go through is going to be easy. Far from it. It's going to be hard. In fact, it will be some of the hardest work you've ever done. It's going to be okay because you love each other, because you love that child. When that child comes, you will love it whether you want to or not. And somehow that love you have for that kid will help you be and help you learn to be the kind of person you need to be the parent that child needs, even if you have no idea what that is or what it looks like. Because that's what love can do. Love doesn't magically make everything easy, but love helps us find the strength, helps us find the calm, helps us find the whatever it is that we need to get through the hard parts. So, when John says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out all fear," he doesn't mean that everything's going to be magically easy. What he means is that the love that we have for each other, the love that we have for God, and the love that we have for ourselves will be the thing that helps us find our way through whatever it is that life throws at us. The love that we share for each other here in this community, here in this church, is part of the reason why, it's probably the biggest reason why, you're here and want to be part of this church. It's good. It is an amazing thing to be part of a community where love of neighbor is lived out. And because it is, and because we do that here, it also means we, like other churches around us who choose that same path, are able to do things that to everyone else may look impossible. And we have done a lot in the last year as a community. We have overcome a year that we could have been defined by fear. We could have been defined by anxiety. We could have define it, "Oh my gosh, we're not sure what we're going to do. How are we going to get through this? What's this going to look like?" Instead, we did what parents have always done, what the people who started the same cafe did. We chose to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. We chose to have faith in God, to have faith in each other, and have faith in ourselves. And we chose to worry less about what we couldn't do and instead figure out what we could do that would let us keep loving God, keep loving neighbor, and keep loving ourselves. And so long as that is the core of who we are, how can we not but succeed in whatever that looks like, in whatever that happens to look like? So permission is given to all of you to let go of some of the fear and let go of some of the anxiety. The radical countercultural permission is given to you to have faith in God, to have faith in neighbor, and have faith in yourself. Not because we're so wonderful and important, but because God is so wonderful. And because we are God's children, we are important. Amen.